Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. With you here on British Muslim TV, Sky Channel 752. We're also online, BritishMuslim.tv. We're on social media. We are wherever you are tonight, so thank you very much for joining us. Each and every week, we are joined by a special guest whom we have the opportunity to interview about those topics that are important to you and I, those issues affecting our community and our world. And today we are going to focus on journalism and the voice of Muslims in the mainstream media. Now, since the terrible atrocities of 9/11 and 7/7, and sadly many other atrocities that have taken place since then, we have seen a particular narrative about the Muslim community in certain parts of the mainstream press that couldn't be further away from the truth. Sadly, this has resulted in a rise in Islamophobia, and we have seen the huge challenge that we as a British Muslim community have faced in terms of addressing those issues, addressing those misconceptions, and also in looking at ourselves, our community, our local area, our families, the types of professions in which we choose to go, our children choose to go. Historically, doctors, dentists, lawyers, barristers, all, mashallah, fantastic professions. Nothing wrong with them at all, alhamdulillah. They have been the basis upon which we as a community have advanced significantly. But still, brothers and sisters, there remains a need for Muslims in journalism. My guest tonight is someone who has really made his mark in that profession. He was a journalist with both the BBC and Al Jazeera. He has developed and built an acclaimed career not only in journalism, but also at the highest level of communications. Hassan Patel joins me tonight on the program. Assalamu alaikum, Hassan. Thank you so much for joining us on Behind the Headlines. A real pleasure to have you with us.
Wa alaikum salam, Ahmad, and it's a pleasure to join you. I always enjoy talking to you, and it's another opportunity for us to discuss ideas and see if we can put some right.
Alhamdulillah, likewise. Now, let me start from the very beginning, Hassan. Well, almost. I think it was about 11 or 12 years ago, you became a trainee, an apprentice, if you like, in a newsroom. But what led you to that place? What made you choose journalism as the career in which you saw yourself headed?
You started your presentation off about 9/11, and we're now approaching 20 years since the anniversary of 9/11. During that period, I was actually a student sabbatical officer at the University of Leicester Students' Union, where I was working full-time in the Students' Union as a student representative. And I think I was one of only two non-white BME student officers. And I remember quite clearly when 9/11 took place, a few media outlets contacted the university to speak to me. They wanted to find out what a young British Muslim student thought about what was taking place during 9/11, what took place at that period. And I did a few interviews for BBC Radio Leicester, who subsequently I started to work for a few years later, and Channel 4 News. And that actually triggered me to try and look to see if I could have a career, not just in journalism, but in communications, because I genuinely felt that the problem wasn't the fact that there weren't any decent Muslim voices. The problem was that within media itself, you had people who had no real understanding of the Muslim community, of not just the Muslim community, but anyone who was from the BME background. And that actually was the kind of the catalyst that allowed me to kind of think, well, hang on, let me see if I could engage with media. So I started to engage with media. And then in 2005 or 2006, there was an advert for a BBC trainee program. And I subsequently applied, and I used my 5 years of experience of engaging with media and some ideas that I had. And then the rest, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had plans for me, and I'm always fortunate that I was given that opportunity.
We are live tonight, dear viewers, so it's not just my questions that Hassan is delighted to answer, but also yours. So please feel free to call in on 01924 231 083. That is a studio number that gets you to us. And of course, you can send us a WhatsApp message. You mentioned, Hassan, not a lack of BME voices, not a lack of Muslim voices, but a lack of those voices in the media and a lack of understanding. Do you think that in those years after the atrocities of 9/11, do you think that lack of understanding of Islam and Muslims led to this subconscious wave of Islamophobia, anti-Muslim sentiment? Was it a subconscious thing that happened?
To a certain degree, yes, because perceptions plays a huge role. And if you come from a particular background and your friends come from a particular socio-economic background in your family and your colleagues, you automatically just have this way of thinking which is similar to many people. And you don't tend to engage with people from various communities. And the same could be said for white working class communities as well. And I felt that there was this kind of tabloid push that was being peddled by certain outlets, and the media themselves, when I mean the media, broadcast media, kind of fell for it. And the problem purely was that they just did not have an understanding of Muslims. I remember during that period between 9/11 and 7/7, I was involved in student activism, and I dealt with a lot of journalists who'd come into Leicester. I was living in the city of Leicester during that period, and they'd come in, they'd do the story, and I remember on many occasions, journalists, their producers would say to me, "This is the first time we're actually talking to normal Muslims."
Wow.
And I found that very strange. What do they mean by normal Muslims? You know, what is that definition? And a lot of the times it was based on perceptions. So they came in with questions which were loaded. I remember once a well-known BBC journalist came into the city of Leicester, and he spoke to myself and my friend, who comes from a kind of an Orthodox Deobandi background. And he asked him, "Do you know any Muslims who've gone on to fight in Afghanistan for Bin Laden and Taliban?" Just asked him directly like that. And my friend was just completely shocked because we never came across anyone who went to Afghanistan matter. But again, a loaded question which had severe consequences on the Muslim community. And it was a kind of a indirect form of Islamophobia, which then perpetuated, and it became a direct form of Islamophobia.
And that then follows on and begs the question of where does this come from? Because as you said, even at that time, even in 2001, 2002, we had seen the first Muslims elected to parliament, various Muslim councillors. We saw Muslim journalists coming forward as well. There wasn't a lack of people involved in public life. Clearly, there has been far more, mashallah, coming forth since. But those people didn't clearly feel as though there was a voice, or there was a voice that would listen to them. So when you entered that newsroom, Hassan, how did you feel after coming across that reporter that you came across? Were you optimistic that you, as a Muslim Asian journalist, budding journalist, were going to be able to make a difference? Do you think you were in a position where you'll be able to write your stories?
I'm indebted to one individual. She gave me my break. She was the managing editor of BBC Radio Leicester, and subsequently she's now the managing editor of BBC Radio Manchester. Her name's Kate Squire. And why I've mentioned her is because she said to me something which has always stuck with me, which is, "Hassan, I don't want you to be a Muslim journalist. I want you to be a journalist who happens to be a Muslim. And I want you to give your input, but I also want you to be a journalist looking at other areas." And what I admired about that was that took the pressure off me, because within that newsroom, there were some people who actually, they were saying, "He's only there because he wants a Muslim. He's only there because he reflects a diverse community of Leicester. He's only there because she wants to get into the Muslim community." But because she took that pressure off me straight away, I remember quite clearly the first few stories that I worked on, it had nothing to do with Muslims or issues pertaining to the Muslim community. It actually had stuff to do about Leicester Market or a football field that may be turning into land for developers. And slowly, I remember in editorial meetings when I got the confidence, because ultimately you're a trainee, I started to give input about the perception or the viewpoint of Muslims. And that actually made a huge difference, because some of my colleagues had no contacts within the Muslim community. And they actually felt slightly empowered that they can come and ask me and talk to me. But at the same time, there were some Muslims within the city of Leicester who felt empowered, thinking, hang on, we know Hassan, we trust him. And that relationship actually became very strong over the years. But it all was due to the fact that she said to me on the first day, do not think you're a Muslim journalist. Think that you're a journalist who happens to be a Muslim.
But that is a very bizarre situation to be in, a situation where in a city as multicultural as Leicester, there was at that time major broadcasters that didn't have those links to a community as prominent, as involved as the Muslim community. But the role that you were able to play in coming along and bridging that gap, becoming that voice, becoming that link is really remarkable when you think about it. Briefly, Hassan, before the break, because we've got a break coming up in a few seconds, do you feel you were able to make that difference, to give that value-add perspective? Did you feel included?
I once did a story about young Muslim lads in the city of Leicester who just hang around street corners at night because they had nothing to do. And the perception was Muslims causing trouble. And I actually went out one evening and I spoke to them, and it just basically materialized. There were no services within that area. There was no help. There was no kind of support as youth centers. And these kids had nothing to do, and they were the product of society.
Right.
I remember doing that particular story, realizing that the fact that I came from that community, that could have been me.
Sure.
I gave them that voice.
Hassan Patel, thank you very much for your comments. We are going to go to a quick break. Please do stay with us, dear viewers. We are exploring the very fascinating story of Hassan Patel and his career in journalism and communications. We'll be back right after this break. Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Behind the Headlines with me, Ahmad Bostan. We are in conversation with the former journalist and communications professional Hassan Patel, who has worked at organizations including the BBC, Al Jazeera, just to name but a few. And he's talking to us about his journey into journalism, why he chose journalism and the role he has been able to play as a journalist who just so happens to be a Muslim. Hassan, before the break, you were speaking to us about a story where you were able to really eradicate the Islamophobic rhetoric that could be above that story. The fact that a group of young people were hanging around on the streets because they didn't have anything to do. Quite typical for young people in various areas around the country who don't have youth services that they can access or facilities that they can use during an evening or whatever. But again, as you said, the narrative of that had the potential of being quite corrosive. Moving forward in your career, how would you describe your greatest achievement as a journalist? If you could put your finger on something that you have done and has made you feel remarkable, has made you feel as though you've made a difference, what would that be?
After a few moments in my career, I think my greatest achievement was in 2017 in heading the online digital planning of what was taking place in Myanmar and Bangladesh due to the Rohingya situation. At that time, I was head of digital planning for Al Jazeera. And yes, like any news outlet, we were covering it, but I actually decided to kind of raised the ante even more. And I deployed around 3 or 4 digital journalists to Cox's Bazar, where the Rohingya refugees were making their way, and getting their story, getting the human story of what I think is probably at that time one of the gravest humanitarian disasters in the world, just because someone was of a different background, different religion, different creed. They were being systematically killed by the Burmese authorities. And why that is an achievement, we kept that sustained coverage going on for the best part of 3 weeks. I even remember Jahangir Malik, who was an aid worker from the UK. He actually made way from, he was in Bangladesh, and I said to him, I go, try and come to Qatar. Let me get you on the screens. Let me get you on our TV and talk about what you've seen. And he actually did that. He actually came, spent a day in Qatar just so he could talk for 15 to 20 minutes live on air. But that particular incident, that particular period of my life was very stressful, because, you know, you would see normal individuals, and I can just give one example. Her name was Hasina. Her husband was killed. Her entire family were murdered, but her and her 2-year-old daughter survived, and they walked thousands of kilometers to Cox's Bazar to gain safety. And my colleague interviewed her, and the look in her eyes, the tears, you know, it still kind of haunts me today. But we told her story to the world.
What was it like having that burden upon your shoulders? Here are millions of people who have been denied their human rights, and now you are their voice to the world. How did you deal with that? How did you ensure that you could do justice to their story and to their plight? What was it like for you going into that as a journalist who, I would imagine, hadn't seen anything comparable to this or covered anything comparable to this beforehand?
I was sitting in an air-conditioned studio in Qatar, in the city of Doha. I wasn't there, so I was slightly detached, but also from a position of luxury. But I remember journalists that I looked up to have always said to me, this isn't a job, this is actually more than a job. And throughout history, you always get editorial moments where news stories make a huge difference. And for us, for the people running this particular operation, we just felt that the perception of refugees, the perception of victims of this kind of form of attacks, if they're a particular color, or if they're a particular background, or if they come from a particular religion, somehow the world ignores it. And we only had to turn the screens onto BBC, Sky, CNN, and partly their story was ignored by these outlets. So we kind of felt at Al Jazeera that we actually had a moral duty to tell the story, and we did go big. But then that's Al Jazeera for you. Al Jazeera constantly would make people understand that we tell the human story. I'm not slightly deviating, but I remember when Prince George was born, the third in line to the British throne, all the news outlets were spending hours and hours camped outside a hospital talking about his birth. Yet that day, there was a very devastating earthquake in Nepal, and Al Jazeera went with that as their lead story. Some lives don't matter, some lives do, but ultimately, it's our responsibility to tell those stories. And that's what we were doing. We were telling the stories. We weren't taking an opinion, we were just presenting the facts. And I think it did pay off to a certain degree.
Do you think that as a journalist, being able to tell those stories, were you able to influence the actions of governments? Because certainly when you speak about the terrible atrocities which continue to this day against the Rohingya community, a community that for generations after generations have lived in Burma, now Myanmar, denied those rights of citizenship to which they are entitled. do you think that your reporting, the role that you were playing as a journalist, was that putting pressure on politicians, putting pressure on governments, putting pressure on those in power to do more by way of sanctions or whatever they eventually did do? Did you feel you had a role in pushing that forward?
I think if another administration was in Washington during that period of 2017, things could have been slightly different. But we had an administration who believed in America first, and they didn't really personally care. Nevertheless, we kept that sustained pressure on. And I remember there was moments where the UN Secretary General was interviewed. We put that pressure on, and the Burmese government didn't want to speak to Al Jazeera. I remember quite clearly during that time. But we kept that on, that it affected the mindset of the world, and a lot of humanitarian help came. Our Sikh brothers and sisters, Khalsa Aid, I remember someone told me that they're there in Cox's Bazar, and we found them and we did a story about them, showing this isn't just a Muslim issue, it's a humanitarian issue.
Yes.
And look, I'm not being naive or idealistic in any way. I wouldn't say because of myself or my colleagues, we sorted the problems out. But we kept that story on the airwaves, and we kept that story going. And for that reason, who knows, if one life was saved, we may have contributed in some manner.
Yes.
And that's probably the kind of the key thing that motivates people. If we can make a difference in some way, in some manner, then we can move forward. Coincidentally, I remember during that period, there were Syrian refugees flooding into Lebanon. And one of my colleagues, Zaina Khadr, did a story about how young Syrian girls were being manipulated to offer other forms of services in order for rent. And we did that particular story. And I remember Al Jazeera receiving a lot of queries from NGOs and governments saying, we want to speak to these people, we want to help them. So it can make a difference,
yes,
depending on the story.
These grave and heinous human rights abuses around the world that you describe, abuses against which you have been able to be a voice, an outspoken voice. What's the price that you have paid for that? Because as a journalist who is outspoken, willing to speak your mind, even in just telling the story, there would have no doubt been consequences for you, backlash, prejudice. What have been those challenges, and how have you overcome them? How have you stayed strong in the face of that particular adversity?
I haven't been fortunate where any piece of investigation has had my name to it, which has then had that kind of overt backlash. But on a personal level, many times we would have conversations with colleagues, and it, during these stories, whether it's the Syrian war, or whether it's the Rohingya situation, or whether it's what's taking place in Central African Republic, CAR, it does affect your mental health in some case. And people always say news is always about depression, murder, and depressing sides, and that's true. I agree, and I think that's probably why I left news to a certain degree. I wanted to move into communications, because I left journalism to go into communications, and I went back into the newsroom, and I thought, no, I can't handle this anymore. So I left Al Jazeera and moved back to the UK. But I remember in 2015, Al Jazeera took this decision to not call people coming into Europe as migrants. We took the decision to call them refugees. And we wrote an op-ed on our website about it, and I was part of that team, but it was under the name of someone called Barry Malone, who's a renowned journalist. And I remember the abuse Al Jazeera got, because I was working in the communications team at that time, from right-wing outlets saying that we're kind of trying to humanize a conflict when all of these people, they're not refugees, they're migrants, and they're coming into Europe, etc., etc. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we took that decision because we felt that the Syrian war forced people of affluent backgrounds to escape their country. And that was a result of political inability. And they were refugees, and they should be given that term of being a refugee, not a migrant. And I don't know, Ahmad, if you remember during that period, 2015, 2016, the likes of Nigel Farage, the likes of other populist far-right individuals across Europe were calling them the Muslim hordes, the migrants coming here who are going to come and rape our women, they're going to do this, they're going to do that. But ultimately, they were all refugees, and they deserve that dignity. So I think, for me, it wasn't a case of the pressures of how it affected me. I constantly felt beyond the front foot, beyond the front foot.
Sure. Of course, Nigel Farage isn't here to defend himself, but he would argue that he has always campaigned for Britain to leave the European Union and those values that are close to his heart, which he wouldn't describe as extreme. Of course, there are those who would disagree, but the point you make is a very interesting one. We're going to continue with that discussion, Hassan, right after this break. Remember, you can call in as well and ask your questions to Hassan. Back after this. Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Behind the Headlines live on British Muslim TV with me, Ahmad Bostan. I'm in conversation with the former BBC and Al Jazeera journalist Hassan Patel, who nowadays works in communications, speaking to him about his journey, the successes and indeed the barriers that he's faced along the way, and speaking about how you as a Muslim, as someone from a minority ethnic community, cope in the field of journalism, especially at that mainstream level, especially when you want to go there, become a voice. Is there a backlash? Is there a comeback to what you're actually doing? And Hassan's message is that, you know, of course, when you cover these sorts of stories, there is going to be an impact on you psychologically in terms of your mental health, but you've got to stay strong. You've got to stick at it for as long as you can. Hassan, moving closer to home in terms of the journey that you have had. I was speaking to the Honourable Senator Salma Ataullahjan in my previous program, and she was speaking about how, as a Muslim senator in Canada, she's felt that there was an additional pressure on her from her Muslim constituents, that she's there to represent them, and she should actually, she was actually feeling as though she was held to a far greater level of accountability by them than her non-Muslim counterparts, who themselves represent just the same number of Muslim constituents. Have you felt that? Have you ever felt pressure as an Asian journalist, as a Muslim journalist, that there's a pressure on you from the community to be more of a voice than perhaps your non-Muslim counterparts?
The short answer is yes, but also there's also the added element where, sadly, within the Muslim community, we have people who think that they're experts in many fields that they're not, whether it's law, whether it's media, whether it's politics, whether it's whatever it may be. And I remember quite clearly, I think I managed to say a few things which offended some people within the Muslim community. I remember once the BBC Panorama were doing an investigation into an organization, a Muslim organization in the UK, in a particular city. And the Muslim community's response was to bury their head in the sand and just kind of not respond and then issue some kind of pithy statement. And I'm saying, no, I think if you're confident in it, speak, talk to them. I'm more than happy to help. And they kind of started to take the advice of self-appointed leaders, thinking that they know how to handle the media. And to be fair, the strategy that they took resulted in a very, very damaging report on this organization. And they didn't get their facts out. But what I'm trying to say is that I genuinely think that the problem I've always had is that I've always had to listen to experts, in inverted commas, within the Muslim community who think they know more about media and comms than the expert themselves. And then that's the pressure, because when things don't go their way, they then kind of blame the Muslim in the media, saying, well, you work for them, you must be the problem. Oh, you've sold out. For you to work for them, you must have sold out. And that kind of personal battle sometimes I tend to find a bit strange, and something which I think is a detriment to our community.
But let me ask you that question head on, because there'll be people out there who are watching this program who love journalism, who love the idea of being on radio and television. They would love to come on British Muslim TV and present, and of course you're more than welcome. But they wouldn't go to mainstream broadcasters because there's this perception that you got to leave certain parts of your identity at the door. Is that true? Does that happen? Did you have to compromise on who you are to get ahead in the mainstream media?
No, I've never had to compromise. We work in a multicultural setting. We work in an environment with different cultures, different ways of life. We have to understand the nuances of living and letting live, for example, and that I kind of stand by, and that I understand. That for some people, that may be a perception saying, "Oh, you're giving up your values in this aspect," but ultimately, you could be working in an insurance company or working with different types of people. Are you giving up your values there? Not really. So you hold on to what's strong for you, and it's a case of engagement and discussing. And also, I remember one Muslim individual one day contacting me, asking me if he could present a show on Al Jazeera. He's never had any media experience whatsoever, but somehow he thought he could be a good presenter. And I said to him, I go, you need to earn it. And I think that's something that we also need to understand. In whatever field you may be, you need to earn it. You need to actually put in the hours, put in the time, put in the sacrifices. Sometimes it'll pay off, sometimes it won't. I remember people always say to me, "Well, I've never seen you in front of a TV screen." Actually, this is probably the first time I've actually sat in front of a screen and spoke on TV for many years. But ultimately, I genuinely used to always believe that my career trajectory as a journalist was one of a producer or an executive producer or a head of planning, where you actually make the decisions to know what content to push out. I don't have the face for TV, hence why I didn't take that approach.
Very interesting. Remember, you can ask your questions to Hassan as well. We're live tonight. 01924 231 083 is a studio number. You can WhatsApp us your questions, your comments as well. What do you think is the role of Muslims in terms of the media? Are we engaged with the media enough? Are our children, our grandchildren, and indeed our community in general, are we going forth and being active in the media? Do you agree with Hassan? Hassan says quite clearly he didn't have to sell anything. He didn't have to compromise on anything in terms of his own identity to get ahead in mainstream media. Would you agree with that? Did you have the same experience, or would you disagree? We'd love to hear from you on the program. So Hassan, where do we go as a community when it comes to the challenges that we're facing now? Now, I take your point that, of course, journalists that work for any broadcaster, they're not just Muslim journalists, they are journalists who are proud of their Muslim faith, proud of Britain and the country that they're from, but they are there to cover all sorts of stories on all sorts of subjects. But in terms of the challenges the Muslim community is facing, namely Islamophobia, how do we deal with that? How do we tackle that head on? Is that through the Muslims that are in the journalism field, or is that not really their job? Is there a danger that Muslims in journalism could fall into the bracket where they're just covering stories for Muslims? How do we deal with this?
I think it's a bit of both. I think those Muslims who come from particular communities of activism and they want to make that difference and they want to go into journalism, the fundamental thing for a good journalist is to have a good contact book. And if you've got contacts of good, prominent Muslims who are doing stuff within the community, tell their story, make the world aware that there's great work taking place within the Muslim community. During COVID-19, the number of Muslim organizations that provided food for food banks, who gave shelter, who gave support, who donated things, was immense. And we heard those stories, we saw those stories. That actually deals against Islamophobia in some aspects. But also at the same time, it's about dialogue. It's about engaging with other individuals from other communities to make them understand what the key issues are. And I think finally, it is not a kind of a requirement for anyone who's a Muslim, who's a journalist, to constantly focus on Muslim stories. If you excel in your job, and you've got your faith and you've got your identity and people know you because of your faith and identity, that in itself dispels many, many myths. Look, for example, Channel 4's Fatima Manji. She presents Channel 4 News. She's not doing Muslim stories all the time. There's Aina Khan, who works for New York Times recently. Again, she does various stories from various... and she used to do stuff for British Muslim TV, if I'm not mistaken, a few years ago.
Yes.
So again, it shows, it's about presenting yourself and taking that particular approach. And look, Islamophobia is on the rise. We have to take that on. We have to tackle that. But also at the same time, we as individuals need to question those in authority, those in the media, and actually call it out for what it is. The good example recently, and I know it's not Islamophobia, but it was racism towards the England cricket football team taking the knee and Black Lives Matter. We need to be part of that campaign as well to kind of support those who are doing it, because they're doing it in our name. And yes, get involved in the media, but also at the same time hold them to account.
And that's a really important point, because as you said, as Muslims, we're not just concerned about Islamophobia, we're concerned about all forms of racism, all forms of discrimination and hatred that lead to the unpleasantness which exists in our society, which leads to harm and to hurt of people, which is condemned and deplorable whomsoever is the victim, and the importance of being allies in those causes as well, in terms of how we play our role here in this great country of Britain. But Hassan, I need to come back to this point. People will say, great, we've got Muslims on the media. We got people with Muslims' names that are news broadcasters, that are presenting programs, that are even in production rooms. But why is it that a white supremacist, someone who's a far-right extremist, is not called a terrorist by certain parts of the mainstream media? Why is it that that terminology doesn't exist? If we as Muslims are playing our role in media, then why are we still fundamentally failing to get the narrative correct in these newsrooms?
I think that's firstly a very valid question, and something that we grapple with all the time as individuals. It's not just the media. There's a whole industry that aids and abates Islamophobia through think tanks, through certain politicians, as you just said, far-right extremists. And they all work hand in hand to try and get their agenda across. And sadly, sometimes the media, or some aspects of the media, buy that argument. They follow that lead. And if you follow the money trail, you'll see where this money leads to. And I think the problem that we have to a certain degree is that we want to look at the symptom, but not the cause. And the cause is that there is an agenda there. And I'm not saying that in some conspiratorial way, but right-wing groups, right-wing think tanks, individuals who don't believe Islam is compatible with the West, who don't believe Muslims can play a constructive role within society, fund reports, fund certain things, and then they give it to the politicians who push that rhetoric, who then they give it to their friends in the media who push that rhetoric. And we're seeing that at this moment, for example, on the war on woke, as people call it. They are looking to attack certain liberals and using this cancel culture, but they themselves have that cancel culture. So it's not just the job of the media here. I think if you really want to make a difference, get involved and do things across the board.
Hassan Patel, stay with us. We're going to continue this discussion right after the break. You can join it as well. 01924 231 083. It's Behind the Headlines, back right after this break. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Behind the Headlines here on British Muslim TV. And tonight we are in a live discussion with former BBC and Al Jazeera journalist Hassan Patel about his journey in journalism. And before the break, I was asking Hassan, we have so many prominent Muslim names coming forth in the press at the moment, be it the broadcast press or indeed the old printing press, as it's called, the newspapers, etc. But why is it that not just Muslims, but journalists who believe in equality are still failing to get across the line when it comes to these narratives we see, where if someone is a far-right extremist and they commit a deplorable attack, they're not called a terrorist. They're not called someone who has committed an act of terror, which they clearly have done. Why? And Hassan spoke about how it's not just journalists that need to be playing their role, but it's all of us that need to be involved in that. And Hassan, that brings me on neatly to ask you about the solution to this, because, mashallah, there is so much the British Muslim community has to be proud of. We are one of the most, if not the most giving religious community in the United Kingdom. The amount of funds that we give to charity, and we've seen it so often even here on British Muslim TV, is truly remarkable. But where are we getting it wrong as a community? Are there particular channels, are there particular things that we should be investing in that we're not right now?
I think the Muslim community needs to start investing in ideas and also the thought processes, whether it's through think tanks, whether it's through kind of centers, whether it's through the kind of form of academia and community engagement or community organizing. Yes, bricks and mortars are lovely and buildings are lovely, but what goes inside is what matters. And for example, you've heard of the Centre for Media Monitoring, and they constructively dialogue with media, and they're trying to empower communities to make change. And they've done reports, they've issued reports where certain news outlets have changed their reporting of British Muslims, and especially Daily Express in particular, due to the Centre for Media Monitoring. We need to invest in our future, in our young people, giving them that opportunity and chance. And because I kind of partly work in academia, I can honestly say that the universities can play a huge role in disseminating and researching that information, but more importantly, trying to give recommendations. And of course, Ahmad, something you're familiar with more than anyone, it is to engage in the political processes as well, locally, nationally, and really, being there, making a difference in the community on all sorts of issues. It takes time, and things will not change overnight, but we are in a far better situation than we were a few years ago. Just for myself, as someone who worked in media, when I started 15 years ago, it was very rare to find various Muslims from kind of backgrounds in the media. Now it's common, but also it was rare to find politicians or people on TV or think tanks. We need to do more. We need to really take that forward.
And some people say, what's the value in these think tanks? They write reports, but they actually do, as you said, change the way that media outlets go about things. Because let's face it, the argument has been made that sadly, we as a Muslim community, because we're not organized in that particular way in terms of think tanks, community groups, and community organizing as perhaps we could be and we should be, there are those news articles, there are those journalists who will put together articles that are blatantly Islamophobic because they know and they feel that there won't be a backlash from it, Hassan. Is that a reality you've experienced?
To a certain degree, certain outlets do it because they know there will be no backlash. However, due to, again, the Centre for Media Monitoring or individuals taking that kind of action, some news outlets have had to take that step back. There was this constant problem over the past year on the reporting of COVID, for example, and somehow every single picture you'd always find on a news outlet was always of a Muslim woman wearing a face mask. And I found that slightly funny because the same news outlets used to have Muslim women with niqabs on, and now they've got Muslim women wearing face masks, but the narrative was different, the context was different. And some people would actually hold up the media to say that, saying, well, why are you taking this approach? Certain right-wing commentators during the first lockdown was coinciding with Eid, and they were more or less blaming the Muslim community. However, action was taken, and certain outlets had to kind of retract that comment. If we're organized, it makes a huge difference. It doesn't need immense strategy. You don't need to kind of do so many things, but you need to kind of work together and also understand our kind of expectations of what we can achieve as a community. And the more organized we are, the better we could be. And like I said before, Ahmad, rely on expertise.
Yes.
There are expertise in our politics, in media, in academia. Rely on them. They've worked hard to get to a certain place in their life. And they did it because they wanted to make a difference. And sometimes what they may say may make sense.
A very important point. And as you've said there, you know, words have consequences. Sadly, we've now seen 2 horrific terrorist attacks in Canada alone in the past couple of weeks where Muslims have been harmed, where Muslims have suffered. And that is Islamophobia, that is anti-Muslim hatred that has really gone out of control in the minds of deluded individuals, far-right xenophobic individuals who have been brainwashed in a particular way, and their actions are just as dangerous as those who are terrorists that have committed terrible atrocities because of groups such as Daesh and other abhorrent organizations that have caused death and destruction around the world.
And I'm just on that one point. I work in communications, and I am not going to shy away from the fact that spin works and spin sells. And sometimes I genuinely also feel how you articulate yourself, who you put forward, what kind of messaging you have, how the pictures are, makes a huge difference. If you've got a bunch of angry men shouting, that doesn't help. If you've got calm responses, that does help. And it's about being strategic in those aspects as well. And I am not belittling anyone by saying you can't dress in a certain way or you can't look in a certain way. No, that's not the issue. It's about how you present yourself. And if you want to win over the wider community, we also need to, as a community, understand that there's a narrative that's been painted. Let's not feed that narrative. Let's go against that narrative.
Absolutely. And you talk about COVID and the challenges of COVID, and you mention how Muslims, Asians, people from minority ethnic communities have been really put on the headlines in terms of, oh, they're the ones breaking the rules and they're the ones who are super spreaders and all of these types of headlines that we've seen. But actually, in recent times, prominent individuals who have actually come out and broken the COVID rules have arguably caused more problems and more undermining of those particular rules than the Muslims that some articles and some outlets have claimed are breaking the rules, when in reality, when you go to your local masjid, you will find more COVID safety measures than you can ever imagine. MashaAllah, the community's been brilliant when it comes to that. It's a bit of an irony, isn't it, when you look at the reality versus what the media report?
And the media, to a certain degree, especially those who aren't public broadcasters, are in the job of making money through adverts, through clicks and clickbaity articles. And to a certain degree, certain things work. I remember I actually contacted one news outlet because Eid prayers were cancelled because of the first lockdown, and they had a photo of Muslims praying as a Jamaat as their headline picture. And I said, your article says there's no Eid prayers, yet you've got a picture of Muslims praying together. That's feeding the stereotype, isn't it? And the journalist understood that, and she actually removed the photo and put something else. And recently, I remember when Leicester was in lockdown, there was this big push about minority communities not respecting the lockdown, yet hundreds of people went to the beaches of Bournemouth and had a good time. And I think it's a case of actually showing this duplicity. It's about highlighting that. And I think the more and more we do that, we actually have allies elsewhere who see that bigger picture. And It's about being confident on your narrative. A lot of people from the BME community died more than the population figures in data itself from COVID. So it shows it wasn't because we were having a good time partying at each other's homes. There are many economic, social inequalities that need to be done as well.
Hassan, finally, briefly, if you would, there'll be many people watching this program tonight inspired by your story. wanting to enter the world of journalism communication, what would be your advice to them?
If things were different when I started journalism, I remember a colleague said to me in 2006, I don't think this Facebook's going to kick off that well. It's going to be a failure. So things have changed so much, and specialist media, faith media, community media, they also have a massive part to play. Social media has a massive part to play. Look, journalism doesn't pay that well, but you know, alhamdulillah, my nephew has just started working for a particular outlet, and I've told him, just speak to people, speak to journalists, get their expertise, and just try. On the final message I could say is that if you want to go into journalism, there's a lot of people out there who are willing to help and give you their time. Listen to what they say. It's going to be a slog, but you're not going to end up becoming presenter of Newsnight on your second week. It takes time.
Hassan Patel, thank you very much for joining us tonight on Behind the Headlines. Your story has been an inspiration and is an inspiration. And I thank you also for the candor with which you have addressed the very controversial points that exist, including those which are points of improvement for us as a community, particularly in our role in media and the wider society.
And I just want to say, Ahmad, you're an inspiration to me, and what you do locally and nationally, it makes a huge difference. May Allah reward you. May you continue doing that.
All of us, inshallah. Hassan Patel, Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much, dear viewers, for joining us. Inshallah, we'll be back very soon. Until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.